Well, here we come to the sometimes the most difficult bit, which is the spontaneous part. You'll notice that under the discussion forum, named slightly strangely State of the Archive Art, the idea was to make some sort of review of what we've heard today and identify. We've heard lots of beautiful things. Identify those beautiful things and perhaps discuss some of things where we still have progress to make. The idea of transparency as in addition to openness was explicitly raised today, and we have Massimo De Angelis with us, who's been one of the organisers of the meeting, who's worked in a completely separate field on in the field of transparency. And so we thought we'd start off with Massimo telling you what he's done in this different field.
It's a very quick introduction just to speak about transparency. Well, my name is Massimo De Angelis. I am a member of the independent evaluation board of this Italian Space Agency. One of the main tasks of this board is to assess the transparency and to see if it's compliance with the transparency regulations, Italian regulations. And a few words just to introduce the concept of transparency in Italy, how it's changed over the years. In the beginning, transparency meant to ask for requests, especially when you were involved in public proceedings, and then to protect your interests, because maybe you are involved in a public proceeding or competitions, and but this was 1990, and in 1990 was forbidden to ask too much information about public institutions, or in order to have a kind of external control from community to the public institutions. In 2009, the concept of transparency changed, and we speak about access to wide categories of data defined by law, where each Italian public institution had to be compliant in order to encourage good governance and meritocracy. Nowadays, 2016, well, the concept of transparency is even wider. Each citizen may ask for data. The requirement is that the data is held by the public bodies. This to monitor government and to prevent corruptions. The requirements changed. So if in the beginning it was the requirements was a request from people involved in public proceedings, now the requirements that every public body must be compliant is to have data usable with open format, accessible, comprehensible, complete, interactive, discoverable, and dynamics. Well, as you can see, the transparency is a concept that changed a lot. In Italian Space Agency, we also try to assess transparency, and we developed a model in 2012, and we applied this model to a sample of 13 Italian ministries. This was attempting to evaluate transparency, and as you can see, just 3 ministries were in the spot of talking transparency, where we have a communicative transparency between community and public institutions. After this introduction, what I did today, I was thinking about how many things in common there is between transparency in science-based data and transparency required by the law for the Italian institutions. And the exercise I made today was to note all the components that came up during the day. Maybe I missed something, but that's the most I remember. New technologies, usability, integration, interoperability, discoverable, comprehensibility. For each of these components, we already developed a description, and it's nice now to see if there is some differences between transparency in space science data and transparency in Italian regulations. I also wrote down some advantages of transparency that came up today. Even maybe I lost something, but I think that that's more important that came up. Science productivity, reduce duplication, improve democracies and encourage innovative use of data, increase participation, reaching scientific results faster, enhance public debate and help to safeguard misconduct from scientists. I also wrote down some obstacles and limits to transparency. Lack of resources, lack of incentives, and then other things that I took from bibliography, which is the free rider problems, when at least in other fields people take advantage of other researchers and then they use them without any kind of internal costs. Of other ethical issues, for example, according to literature, sometimes transparency is not reached because researchers are afraid that of the loss of publications when they share unpublished data. But there are also other ethical issues that I would like that maybe during the discussion came up. So the question today is increased demand for transparency, which are the challenges? To me, my opinion is that maybe we should, the work is to mitigate between advantages and obstacles for more transparency. And we should work on the context in which decisions are made, the architecture of the choices, to work on awareness, incentives, standards, metrics, default rules, and that's belong to scientists because you have a very important responsibility, especially because you manage projects that they are publicly funded, and your role is very important in the creation of and communication of your knowledge. It's a very important role. The discussions, the topics that would be nice to discuss today, following today's presentations, are more or less 4, but we can add more points. And one is about, according to the reality you have seen about the actual archives, which can be the drivers to assess and promote transparency. And now I give the talk to you, and to you, to have really a chat, because the beginning this time was should be dedicated to discussion with you and to have your opinion about each point.
Thanks, Massimo. So I think do these questions boil down to whether archive services in astronomy and space science would benefit from a similar process of external review, because that's what happened in the ministries. The answer could be yes, the answer could be no. If the answer is yes, how are the metrics devised along supposedly similar lines to those that Massimo has described in a completely different context? So is there a need for this type of the type of formal assessment that Massimo has described? Would it help archive services make progress if progress is needed?
I think this is a very nice theoretical approach. However, we have a very practical thing here. And when you talk about transparency, you have to first define who you want to be transparent to. Because, as you have seen from the presentation, transparency of the existing archives to scientists is already achieved. You may improve it. No, Paolo, I mean, you can improve it, but it's very clear for a scientist working in the field what is available and what is described in the archives. You can improve it, but it's there. If you talk about public who has no idea of physics and astronomy, then it's a different story. And then you have to ask, what is the purpose that you want to achieve with transparency for people? Take an example. I mean, I'm sorry that Battistone is not here. Take the AMS data that shows an excess of positron. What means transparency to the public? You first have to teach people what quantum mechanics is before you can say this is transparent to you. So I'm very favorable to achieve transparency, but that is a prerequisite which has to educate the customers to even understand what transparency means. So all this is very nice, but you have first to define who you want to address with the open universe. If it is the general public, then the data is a minimum part of the exercise. The big part is education.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would like to add a comment if possible, because Piero just raised the problem. The example of AMS. For instance, AMS, they also see gamma ray data, but we cannot access those gamma ray data. We have 4 missions in the space, and we can get gamma ray data from Agile and from Fermi, but the same gamma ray data you cannot get it from AMS and from DAMPE. So those are not transparent. That's what we mean. Okay, sorry.
You really have to define who is the end customer of Open Universe. Then we can discuss the details. But if you don't define that, I mean, we had a different perspective this morning. You gave a perspective which is mainly accessed by scientists. Roberto Battistone gave a view of saying we have to address the general public. So you have to decide which you want to go, and then we can discuss transparency. Otherwise, it remain very theoretical.
That's exactly what we want to do.
Yes,
But,
thank you.
I know Bruno wants to
So, I mean, I think he was commenting about the AMS on purpose at this point, and no, about the gammas.
The gammas, yes.
Yeah, in the sense that, okay, I think that the positron data from AMS, of course, for general public to understand what they mean, they should have a full education in physics, by now. And I think that in most of the sites, in the publication and so on, for what regards the scientific publication, what is written is just that this is an access with respect to background, and then there's plenty of conferences where this is debated from where it comes from. So, in this sense, the collaboration has no responsibility in educating all the world, or maybe this should be part of a mission, the outreach and the, let's say, education of people. And I will address this part in tomorrow, since I'm... From what regards the gamma rays, you were mentioning gamma rays from AMS, from DAMPE. For what regards AMS, gamma rays, it's a possibility, but up to now, there's not a single publication that involves gamma rays. And this is something, and it's not a single publication because the objectives, the scientific objectives of AMS are not gammas as priority. And the instrument has not been conceived in order to do this physics. It's a possibility, but it's not something that is being done. So how can you share some results that you don't have? So when the results will be available, they will be shared. For DAMPE, you know better than us, there's some, this was not the point of the first, but I'm answering to Paolo. For DAMPE, whenever there will be a photon list, and this will be available, It will be published. But up to now, there's not a photo list from the collaboration.
Yes.
And
What I'm saying
these
is
are not.
in the future, there should be a commitment. If you spend €1 billion to provide the data itself, that's all. Just like
Okay, Paolo, this is part of course, of the larger debate. It cannot be one-to-one debate, I hope.
I mean, this is a cultural debate of high energy physics with respect to gamma rays observatories or X observatory, astrophysical observatories. Either you put it in the funding in the MOU, or you don't put it in the MOU.
And this is one of the points that this morning has been raised by the NASA representative here, to have a data management plan up front. And then in another data management plan done up front, of course, if there are general rules, can be taken into account. And then, let's say, one point that I could disagree with you, Piero, is that despite it's true that each database, data archive, is per se on a single family almost transparent or accessible, nevertheless, the difference between one approach and the other exists, and I don't know, it's just a question, if there is any way to have a better or more homogeneous or easily an easy possibility to access data. I don't know, I mean, maybe yes, maybe no. Maybe that is not useful at all. I mean, it's...
Sorry to insist, but I want to be clear. Otherwise, I took AMS just for an example. I could have taken LIGO results. I can do other. The point is, you first have to define who is the end user of the open universe exercise. Then we can enter into the details and discuss problems. If you don't do that, the discussion remains always vague, because what I heard now is a transparency for a scientist, not for the general public. So yeah. That's the point.
I want to make two comments regarding this. The first one picks up on the AMS example. When we organized the International Cosmic Ray Conference in Rio, I was the cicerone of Samuel Ting. So I stayed with him for 2 days and I took him to journalists to talk to people and being interviewed. Yes, and a journalist asked him, so when do you plan to release your next set of data or your final results? And he said, well, I don't have a plan on that. I can do that whatever I want because I have no competition. Well, I think his experiment cost $1.5 billion in the time of the 2009 economic crisis in the US. So one of the end users of the transparency is the taxpayer. I think this is an important thing. So this is the first point I would like to make. The second point is, and this is to bring a point of view of the third world, is the fact that an initiative like the Open Universe can be really important for developing data science in countries where it doesn't exist. So we have seen people from 5 or 7 countries, developed countries, discussing about their data initiatives. But the UN and the world has 190 member countries. And these countries, we saw the example of Russia, I'm going to give the example of Brazil, they don't have an organized data center. And a part of this is because we lack resources, we lack manpower, and if we have to do everything from the scratch, it's very difficult. But if we have an initiative that gives all the structure that we need to start with and helps us to upload what we have in there, then we can take the endeavor, and this is beneficial for our science. And so I think that the fact that there is such an initiative within the United Nations is extremely important. I see, from the point of view of the third world, that the open universe can be directed to us in a unique way. No initiative can be directed to us in this way, because it's an instrument for development, social development, scientific development, our country's general development. So I think this is really important to consider.
Thank you. I think that is one of the possible answer to your point, Piero. Who is the end user or possible users of this? But this arises another point, because the difference between countries that more or less is the ones that as presented today, and the rest that is part of United Nations and COPOS also have a language issue. And this also has to be worked out indeed. Well, we are speaking English and that's fine, and it's more or less a good or broken English, well, with some exception, of course. but indeed is something that cannot address the whole United Nations representativeness. So this is another point. Yeah, I mean, one answer is humankind, maybe. Then within the humankind we have different layers and different way to communicate, indeed, because it's not the same. The layers of very educated scientists can access all the data already now. What we want to do maybe is to lower the point, either to let anyone that is not completely educated to grow up enough to be, active, fully active, and either to educate a new generation at a lower level to support us also with respect to, let's say bluntly, is also needed for having funds to survive properly, to have the awareness of all the people supporting you in what you do. It means that they have to know what you're doing.
I have maybe a practical question. I've been involved many years in questions of interoperability in the United States. Among various agencies, I was a member of an interagency committee that end up recommending that we have such a thing. And the data management plans that NASA instituted years ago, now they're kind of mandated over. But the point is that you need, it's totally, you cannot mandate anything unless you attach some incentive. So at least in the United States, we function with money. I don't know in the rest of the world. So if a person gets a grant from a government agency, then that person now is required to write a data management plan. Okay. If you want to build a telescope with government money, then you have to have such a plan and you have to explain what's going to happen to your data. But you could build a telescope with private money. And in the US, this happens all the time. The major telescopes are private. Those people are not bound by anything. So they could be good citizens. But, this is, I think, if you go worldwide, it's even worse. Because you deal with different countries, with different systems. The statement of the wish that there is interoperability, we all share it. And we all work towards that. But how you obtain it, there are two aspects. One aspect is, as Piero was saying, is who is the customer, because that means different things. And the second thing is what is the mechanism? Different communities have different mechanisms to design their experiments and they're bound by different customs in terms of proprietary data. For example, astronomers are very open with their data, and that's well known. Physicists are not. And, that's just an example.
No, but it's true. Yeah. I agree.
Okay. You first.
So, although I started off as a physicist, I guess I'm technically now a social scientist, because my PhD is in social science, and it's actually this concept of transparency is actually quite a well-studied phenomena. For example, what right or what impetus does a non-governmental charity have to publish data about their operations? So, people have thought about this quite a lot, and it seems that the current answer is that transparency is not an objective thing that's kind of out there to grasp. It's something that's decided by a group of people, and it's tentative. So, I see this as a justification for the key role of global bodies like the United Nations that can define a standard of transparency that then is out there to be taken. And I mean, I think that would be perhaps one of the key objectives of such an initiative like this, to create a standard. So, rather than going down the route of kind of centralized physical systems to control data, maybe create a set of general principles that define a level of transparency in science.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is what Massimo was trying to do just before, just to identify the elements composing transparency, and then maybe apply a metric to each component. And then also maybe, as Piero was saying, transparency is something which is relative to the end aim, which is, if it is a scientist, it's something. If it is the general public, it's something else. And then maybe we could have different levels depending on who is the beneficiary of this transparency. And all of these elements we could discuss, and that's the reason we are here to discuss and to see if there is a consensus. And then maybe, if you all agree, then we can maybe propose that as something to be applied. Roland wanted to say something.
I think we could use the output of that for us. Yesterday I was in a meeting with a representative of our minister, and there was the PI of the mass spectrometer and Rosetta that was there. And she was complaining because she had to provide to ESA a number of services related to data, but she had no resources. And the representative of our minister says, I have no money for this, I want to spend the money in the industry for hardware. I think if we have such rules that are set up at a high level, international level, we could then face our own funding agencies with this type of recommendation, if it is not rules. And this could be extremely useful for us to explain them that spending a very small fraction of the hardware money on such things is very important. And these people, I am not sure they trust us, but maybe they would trust a body like United Nations.
Yep, I think that is your point is correct. I mean, if you rise the level of a recommendation, then you may use it.
This sort of came into my head that a lot of the things that we saw today, data centers doing interesting things, making things available, innovative tools. I don't think any of those have come about because of rules or because of mandates. I think it's come about because of inspiration and cooperation and wanting to go beyond what what you might have as the basis of producing some scientific data and making it available. So I'm not sure that a rules-based system is going to sort of get what you really want in the end.
What sort of fraction of take-up of IVOA recommendations is there? I mean, you've quoted some very fine examples, and many of us are exceptionally enthusiastic fans of VO standards. How many people resist them? Is it 50% of the possible constituency?
Well, I don't think you can tell. And again, in IVOA, we do have this concept of validation, and in fact it's very important now that when you produce a standard that it has reference implementations, and eventually there should be validators that say, okay, if this service signs up, at what level is it compliant with the standard? And so there's no sort of heavy rules-based thing in there, but in fact the people producing the data and the services really want to actually have these validators to check that what they're doing is compliant. It's not because they're fearful of not complying with the rules that's supposed to. In fact, it's a way for them to improve their service to make sure that they're compliant with the rules, they're compliant with the standard. But I think that's been done in a sense. It has to be done by the same people in a way, because otherwise you have it's like a stick. You're trying to force someone to be compliant with something rather than have a community that's growing and wanting to, and sort of realizing that not everything is in place and you can't just automatically tick all the boxes, but it's a growing system, and you have to even assess those standards by how easy it is to implement them. So in the IVOA now we have 3 or 4 places which do validation, and the people who have made the validators are spending a lot of time comparing one between the other, because you get slightly inconsistent results just because of the way you interpret the standard, the way you test it. And then there's this whole issue of, do you have to be compliant with everything in the standard? Usually not. So, if you have a very strict rules-based system, you'll end up with services that are doing exactly what they need to do in terms of providing services to astronomers to do science, but may not be strictly compliant with everything in the standard. So there's something about the community helping each other to deal with that, rather than having something sort of external assessment that it's basically going to be a heavy burden and not really stimulating something, and something that we would end up just ignoring rather than using as a tool to move us forward. That's my opinion anyway.
Well, you've given a much more detailed opinion than I think as anyone has suggested.
Well, I mean, if I may add, I agree with Mark, but there is also another aspect, which is leading by example. And I think that's how the IVOA and the IVOA uptake is happened. I mean, there were a few big centers that started this all, but now there are more and more, and new projects are looking towards having IVOA standards, as a matter of fact, in their data systems. Once you have a critical mass, this is going to happen. And but you have to work at it. I mean, you can just state it and people will do it. You have to convince them that that's the way to go, with the advantages.
Sorry, just a point. I mean, I think that there are different communities with different rules, even that, because in a planetary science, NASA, ESA, ASI, whoever oblige the use of PDS or PSA, whatever it is. So it's an obligation. But indeed, if we speak about privates, as you were mentioning, or in astrophysics, where, it's not so direct between who gives you the money to do the science and the science that you're doing. There is a different articulation, it's much more difficult. But again, the point is, do you think that if there is some kind of recommendation at higher level as the United Nations, is a negative effect, or is simply not useful? Because if it's not negative, why not? Sorry.
Well, I was just going to make a point from a little while ago that may not be pertinent anymore about bottom-up versus top-down, and versus, the idea that we're directed to follow this or that standard. Different organizations function different ways, but I can tell you that the things that have happened in Canada, which I think compared to other astronomy places are very progressive. I think so, and people tell me that, and maybe they're just being nice, but I think they're fairly progressive. They come entirely from the people inside the group. There's no direction top-down to do these things. We, from the bottom up, persuade them that they should give us money to do things. And half the time, if you go 2 levels above me, they don't really deeply understand what it is we do, but we persuade them. And we persuade them the validation is our links to the science community. We persuade them that we talk to our science community, and our science community believes in what we do. That's how we persuade them. Not that we're wonderful, but our science community is demonstrably very effective, and they use us and they like what we do. So it's this bottom-up thing that has been very valuable. It's all of our achievements are from there. All of the ideas came from within our group. With SKA right now, there's investigation of regional centers for SKA. And these regional centers are not going to be funded by SKA, but they want to be directive of how the different countries establish their regional centers. And this is very much in progress, so I don't want to be horribly critical about it because it's not finalized, but there's this sense of being directed. Now, the progressive elements in data management for astronomy are at the grassroots level. Our group is one of them, and other groups are too. And we will do as much as is possible, and we will be as progressive as we possibly can be with respect to technological possibilities. It doesn't matter a damn what SKA tells us to do. It doesn't matter whether they tell us in great detail what we should do, and it doesn't matter whether they give us carte blanche to do what we do. We will be as progressive as we possibly can. It's of no use to us for people to prescribe from the top down. Rather, it all goes from the other direction. That's my experience. That's my experience. That's all I can say.
Well, as being of a grassroots nature myself, someone never with any authority of any sort, never any management responsibilities, I was always at the coalface, and I have applauded everything the VO has done. However, I've encountered many managers who have not, probably for the reasons of how differently informed they are. But it seems to me that the Open Universe is a grassroots movement, and it's something that tries to encourage. The way I look at it is, it wants to give the IVOA, even more work, and to spread good practice as far as it can possibly go. And if the UN or any other body, it's not going to do anything that smacks of authoritarianism. At least that's the way I look at it. I don't speak on behalf of anyone but myself. But I think this authoritarian notion is completely misplaced.
Before.
I think that we have to proceed, otherwise, I mean, we are going
yes.
to last.
Before to proceed, just one
dinner time.
Before, no, I went reading through the literature to see if there was a combination about science, transparency, open data. I found interesting the human genomic data project, where transparency was reached, and the destinatory of transparency were the scientists. And actually, according to what I read, data are released into the public domain immediately after they have been produced, such in the case of a genomic sequencing data. And before there was an agreement in 1996 with Bermuda Principles. And starting from this point with Genoma, they made great discoveries in this project. But anyway, next point. Role of the UN through UNOSA to facilitate and promote access to and transparency.
How many points have we got left?
Only one, I think.
Because it's time to go home.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you could summarize your findings that came up during this day, first day, 1-2 recommendations.
There is also a point of open data requirements of sustainability of archives and transparency that is similar, but we have, well, we'll have, I think, addressed it at length, so.
Sorry, I'm the guy of terminology, so I want to be sure that we are all talking about the same thing. So we are talking about open data, right? And transparency seems to summarize a set of keywords that are being used in different communities. When we are talking about open data in a multidisciplinary environment, we are talking about data following the FAIR paradigm, where FAIR means findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. This is the buzzword in data science, at the European Commission level at least. So when we're talking about transparency, we talk about these four, the sum of these four characteristics. Are we talking about something different, which include also the traceability of the data processing which has been done to produce the data? Are we talking about something different? Because before trying to give a recommendation to say to the UN to support these sort of activities and things, we need to be precise about the definition.
I can give you my opinion on this, if I can. Okay. Yeah, look, transparency usually in more general terms is something that is usable by the end user. So if the end user is a scientist, then it's something that is usable directly without having too much further processing, ideally zero processing. If you want, you can still do more processing if you want to do something more. But in principle, you just click, just like in case of what Roland was showing. He's doing the analysis of something that is very complicated, that nobody could do it except his team. And then it elevates the level of the data to transparency level, because anyone can just click and get the spectrum. If the end user is a student or something, then transparency level is reached when the data is usable by the people who want to learn in the academy. So if the normal citizen is the ultimate user, then transparency should be something that should be in some way understandable without without having any specific knowledge. This is more or less similar to what is used in transparency in public.
In different fields.
There are different fields, but the concept is that something becomes transparent when it can be used by the people.
Yep.
And then, since there are different levels of people, maybe we can have different levels of transparency. But we are here to discuss. This is my opinion, at least.
We shouldn't forget also there are different types of data, because some of the government data we're talking about is very simple tabular data, and we have.
Yeah, we are here. This is an expert meeting. We could try to define for each type of data what we mean by transparency. That was the idea, to have people here to discuss and think about this, and trying to align to the growing need or perhaps demand for more openness and more transparency in goods that are produced with public money.
Yeah, it was also to try to see if there was possible to find the transparency in space data file. We are a discussion. That's the point was to put all together common knowledge to see if it was possible to get a definition of transparency in space science data.
And if I may comment from the point of view of the UN, I don't speak on behalf of the UN, but there were some comments about authoritarianism. We are not intending to substitute anybody, and God forbid, we're not intending to become a data center or enter in the field of astronomy or do the job of the International Virtual Observatory Alliance. This is a proposal by a member state. How the UN works, we are regulated by member states, and that's basically you and everybody else that is a citizen of any of the countries that integrate us. And when these proposals go forward, we seek the opinion of experts in meetings such as this. We will raise recommendations back to our committees that regulate us. So we don't control what the committee does. The committee actually tells us what our office should be and what our objectives of our office should be in the future. So this is basically your chance to raise recommendations to the UN as to what the Office for Outer Space Affairs should be doing in the field of astronomy to promote your own work, to promote the work of any alliance, international organization, or corporation. It could be just a platform where there are links to all of your activities. It could be something bigger. It could be just, it's basically up to you to decide what our role should be if we do have such a role in this field.
Yeah, I mean, then the point is find the keywords around on which we may have a consensus and a course of action that could be agreed among us, and then give the input for the rest of the process. I mean, the word of transparency we have discussed at length has a variability of interpretations. I think that what you call it fair, that is a good acronym. No, I mean you raised that I'm using it. No, using. Sorry, I didn't want to say that you invented it. I'm just saying that you were proposing it as something that can, of course, is a let's say a general rule, if you like, or general set of rules that are worth to be followed. Either if it's a spontaneous because you feel it inside that it has to be followed, either if you write somewhere. But the point is, do we think that there could be a benefit of having, for example, as was raised now, the possibility to have an access link that is passing through United Nations to reach the different archives? That doesn't mean to impose anything to the single archives, but helps in having a full picture at national level of the at the international level of this. And then I would add something more in any case that has been raised by our Brazilian friend. We need somehow a point that is devoted to the education part. Then we can decide, Piero, which is the level of education where we want to enter first, or in an incremental way. But
when we presented this to the UN, it was not just for education. This was for, in general, for making...
I'm not saying only for education. I say something different. There are different levels, and some of them are straightforward, some of them are less straightforward, some of them can be reached in a short term, some will need more work.
That's for sure. But we should, at least our initial proposal was for the full spectrum, not just something.
Yes, my proposal then has to be discussed and agreed among anyone.
No, just about this word education. So in Brazil, it was really interesting what already started because of this potential evolution of something like the open universe. So I started knowing about this, discussing with Paulo something like 1 year ago, and I started talking to colleagues in Brazil. And in Brazil, we have data center experiences like the Brazilian Virtual Observatory and some things, but which really are not too structured in a very organized high level. And the possibility of things like this that might give some support kind of fostered additional development and discussions in the community at the scientific level, not the educational level to schools, but the scientific level. And we are going to have in 2 months a meeting to rediscuss possibilities of scientific data in Brazil. And this was all fostered by discussions that started a bit less than a year ago, because of the possibility of having some infrastructure, or simply because this raised the question again to the community. So an initiative like this, I think, has the potential to help countries that are not so organized, doesn't have so many resources, to advance in their use of international data centers, in their making available their own data, and therefore by making available their own data, they get more impact of the data they produce, and maybe they get more funds and more development of scientific facilities. So I think there is really the potential for a virtuous circle through this. The question is exactly how to actuate that. But I see something special in the sense that it's a collective effort, a global collective effort within the community that looks through all the aspects. And this I find unique. And I find there is a big potential, especially for us who have very few initiatives from our own.
I think it's probably time to go. But what?
We have just Piero.
But all right, just before Piero comments, please, if you have comments, I volunteer that you send them to Daniel with copies to anyone else that you fancy. But so we've got to somehow synthesize what has been said today, and even hear from those people who haven't spoken. So if you have views, please share them.
Well, my comment is, which might be the final comment of the day, is that presenting all this activity as a project to the UN is a great idea. However, I think we have to be careful on what we present and what we ask. If I may summarize from my point of view, personal point of view, what I heard today is that through the work of almost 15 years, VO reached the point where you have defined a recognized set of standards with the final goal, if you like, of transparency at large, interoperability, reusability of the data, and that is one level that has been achieved. And in fact, all initiatives that I heard of is always say that all what is done compliant to the AVO standards. So we have reached the point where everybody agreed that that is a good thing to have as a standard. On top of that, today I've seen two implementation, which is the Canadian Center and Strasbourg Data Center, who has built, if you like, more than just the standard. Using the standard, they have set up a system which is widely used. And the geographical map that David has shown is quite clear, convincing. It is accessed by a large community. So you have two examples of implementation of systems on top of the standards. Now, what do we want to present to the UN? An improvement of what we have seen, or something new based on the standard? I mean, I think everybody would agree that the standard will stay and can be, say, improved, but it is already achieved. You don't want to discard that. The key point for me is to understand if you want to build something different from what has already existed, or if we want to improve what exists. And again, this is linked to the end user, and see what we want to achieve and what we want to present. I mean, to respond to Ulisse, of course, I mean, you want to improve the accessibility from other countries, but that doesn't mean that you want to build a data center in your country. Because, I mean, you may work in it. I mean, tomorrow I will present the use of AVO in underdeveloped countries through the network that we have achieved. And I try to show, but I mean, I'll stop here, otherwise I say what I want to say tomorrow. But the point is not really for those people accessibility. That is, you know, you can achieve that. Is what you do after the accessibility and how you develop your career, if you like. If we are talking about scientists. If you're talking about general public, then again we open a different can, and then we have to discuss exactly what we want.
Maybe just one thing that just to answer to Piero, we never thought we would ask to do something different from what is existing. There's already an enormous amount of work that has been done over many years, and that's very good. And there's an enormous amount of. Certainly not. We don't want to do that. We just want to encourage to have more data, and the data that is not available now, to be available in an easier way to everybody. That's all. It's a kind of a cultural thing. It's not a technical thing. Sometimes I say we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We have enough wheels and they're very good. Maybe we want to improve the wheels, but we don't want to build wheels. We want to build the vehicle that takes us to the ideal thing, which is all the data available in a transparent way to everyone who actually pays for it. It's something more complex than wheels that we want to build. We need the wheels, but we also need a dream. We need policies, and we need to aim at getting back all the equivalent in terms of data of all those 15 billion euros that are spent every year for producing them in space. So this is basically what we want. We don't want to redo things that are already there and they're working. It would be crazy, of course. Okay, sorry. Now I stop here. I'm really, it's very late.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Well, otherwise the wrap-up is already done. No, please do it.
After you.
No, I have not to say too much. I mean, I took the point of Piero in many sense. I think that the answer from Paolo is clarifying part of this. Of course, I do agree we have not to address standards, not at all. I worked on standards years ago. It's another matter. We take them for granted. It's a matter of different community eventually to discuss how to pass from PS3 to PS4. I mean, this is another matter.
Okay, it's late. See you in the morning.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much.
It's okay. Thank you.